It's the Mannin line. I'm Roger Watterson, and with me is the Treasury Minister, Alfred Cannan, and we're here to take your telephone calls, texts and emails right the way through until 2 o'clock. One or two texts and emails in already, Alfred. One says, why is the Isle of Man government penalising students from the island when the Jersey government is now funding their students to go to college? Free education for Jersey, but not the Isle of Man. What does that send out to families here and the people who are encouraged to move here by the Isle of Man government?
Well, I think that we have at the moment the right balance with our fee structure. I'm assuming they were talking about university fee structure here. The government is still paying for the vast majority of student fees, and it was under the last government that we went from paying 100% of student fees to now asking for a proportion from students themselves, and of course that is now means tested. But we are always looking at these issues and trying to solve every single problem with one go is not always difficult. But we do have a pretty good allowance system to support for fees. The government of 9,500, I think the government asked for about 2,700 or so pounds worth of contribution from the students. So I think on balance we are still giving a lot of support in this area, and we will continue to review our support mechanisms in this particular area.
There was a time when you were talking, not you, but the government was talking about being selective about what types of degrees they supported. There were lots of people who were taking degrees which really didn't have a lot of onward value, certainly none to the Manx economy.
Well, we're working hard, across a number of areas in education, I think, to ensure that we're properly promoting the value for those who don't want to go to university of the educational facilities that are available on the island. And of course, we do work very hard to ensure that there are proper engagement directly between school leavers and employers as well. The government sponsors a very big fair every year, a recruitment fair at the villa. So we are working to ensure that university is not just the only option for students, and there are lots of opportunities on the island with our educational facilities with the Isle of Man College to provide people with skills that will serve them in good stead as they look to build and develop their careers.
It's skills that will fit in with our economy or off island.
Absolutely. I look to the manufacturing sector in particular, where we've been working extremely closely with the manufacturing sector in recent years to make sure that we are actually training and delivering the right skills that are applicable to our major manufacturers on the island, so there is a smooth transition period.
Right. David McWilliams is our first caller of the day. Good afternoon, David.
Afternoon to you, Roger. Good afternoon, Alfred.
Good afternoon, David.
Alf, there's two things that concern me. Basically, the first one is carers allowance. My daughter is partially deaf and cannot work in what you would term as open industry due to the fact of her hearing. She is both a carer for my wife and myself, who are both totally blind, as you know. For that, she has to put in 37 hours a week to each of us, and she gets £112. Now, I really feel, Alf, with that, there are not many people that you know, and certainly not many people in government that would work for £3, £3.50 an hour.
Right. So, is there a question there, or are you just making it?
Basically, can that be looked at with the possibility of the care side? Linking into the second question is caring in nursing care. If somebody like myself, my wife, if we decided we were going into nursing care, it would cost the government £900, £1,000 a week. Now, the government are all the while saying they're giving more money for people like ourselves to stay in our own home. But when you look at the cost of staying in your own home. You go to the third sector where these services are provided, you're looking at £25 an hour. Now, if you need somebody to sit with you on a 12-hour night, from 8 at night till 8 in the morning, in case you need to get up or in case you suffer with vertigo and therefore you need somebody to help, you're looking at about, well, £300 a night. So you're looking at about £2,500 a week. And there's just no way that the normal people out there, Joe Public, can afford that. Yes, there are people that are, I realise that. But certainly Joe Public, the normal rank of people, just couldn't afford it. And therefore, could something not be done that part of the £1,000 be given to the client so that they can provide their own care for what they need?
Okay, well, thanks very much, David. I mean, you've raised a number of issues. I mean, this whole sector, the whole question about people remaining at home for their elderly care when they're absolutely needing nursing care, and the cost of delivering nursing care in the various, mostly private nursing homes is a big issue for us at the moment. And I can tell you there is a group within government, primarily led by the Minister for Policy and Reform, looking at this issue, because we do need to determine how we get some of these costs in general under control. And of course, just in terms of the nursing home care, you're right. I mean, in this budget, we've actually increased the amount available for those in that position, I think, by about £40 a week. And of course, I think you can now claim some £880 a week is the maximum that an individual can claim to help support their care. But we do need to get a grip both of the government's direction and strategy. If we are going to say to people that we want them to stay at home, then absolutely we need to be ensuring that we have got the right support mechanisms in place to ensure that's actually achievable. The other area that we need to get a grip of is the overall costs of nursing care on the island. And in fact, a lot of it is being driven by a lack of staff and the associated cost in bringing people in to deliver that care. You also mentioned about the actual carer's allowance. I think you said 112. I think it's about £113 or so a week at the moment. That is going up in this budget, a 3% increase into carer's allowance. But I do accept the general principle of what you're saying. If you are delivering 100% full-time care, and you want to get that from an external source, then it's going to be very expensive. Of course, the fees, the costs that you're talking about, £300 a day, well, actually, it's going to be cheaper in that instance for you to be delivered care at the current rates in a nursing home. So there's a lot of issues there, David. All I can sort of say in terms of reassurance is, yes, absolutely, we're looking all the time at the benefits that we're paying and making sure they're going to the right places, and carers allowance is absolutely something that needs to be looked at. But secondly, we do need now to get clarity on the support and direction of travel that government's advocating for people who need nursing care.
David, before we move on then, does that answer your questions?
Well, partly, as I say, I do realise that Treasury Minister's job is not an easy one, and he has to do with the money whatever he's got, whatever he can. But I do feel that as both my wife and I are both totally blind, that there should be more sort of understanding and attendance to that need.
David, thank you for joining us today.
Okay, Roger.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Alfred.
Thank you,
Bye.
David.
Bye-bye. Yeah, well, of course, he's talking about there at home, but with the increasing number of elderly population, there's going to be more demand for home spaces as time goes by, which means, of course, that keeping them in their own home perhaps is a better idea in some instances, maybe a bit of redirection of the money.
Well, it is, Roger. I think we need to understand this in more detail, and that's why I said, the Minister of Policy and Reform and a committee are actually trying to get some more clarity around this. But there's also, we talk about this, there's a number of other measures. It's not just black and white. We have to look at how we're supporting the elderly in terms of access to, or encouraging them to stay as fit as possible, making sure that they've got the right access to the right medical services. So there's a lot around it, as well as just dealing with the finite problem of the cost implications. But we do recognise that these costs year on year increase, particularly nursing care costs, and we need to have a clear plan stretching into the next medium term as to ensuring that government's got the right number of spaces available in our nursing homes, but we've got a clear understanding of how we're going to help meet the costs of that as well.
You just put up the amount of money to nursing homes, as you said, to 887. How can you be absolutely certain that as soon as that money goes into the kitty via you, that the nursing homes won't crank up their prices?
Well, this is a perennial issue. Wherever government puts its money to a certain degree, where it directly impacts on sort of private sector provision, what you tend to find is that prices go up. And similarly with preschool provision, we put £1.5 million into preschool provision, recognising the benefits of early year provision. So preschool parents will benefit now £3,420 per year instead of £1,700 when they're putting their children into preschool. But the knock-on effect of that potentially is people trying to raise prices. And I did sound out a warning in the budget, both in care and in privately provided preschools. If the knock-on effect is people trying to take advantage of these support mechanisms, then we need to find ways and measures to clamp down on it, and we will find ways to clamp down on it where we can reasonably evidence those fees are purely profit driven and therefore unjustified.
The Isle of Man is a special place to live and work, says Bonzo. If you're on £50,000 a year, that is. The more than 50,000 a year you're on, the more special it becomes. But the less than 50,000 you're on, the less attractive and advantageous it becomes. Now let's remember the median income is only 29,000 a year. But I forgot, MHKs and MLCs are on about 50k a year as a basic. So that's all good for them. I'm not absolutely too sure of the point in that, but...
Well, I think the point that they're trying to make is that, the less salary you're on, then the Isle of Man becomes a more difficult place to live. And I think we've already recognised that. If you go back 2 years and you look to where comparatively the same benchmark salaries are being used, and look today how much more people are better off than they were 2 years ago, then I think we've made progress. There's a long way to go, Roger. I mean, we have been absolutely adamant in everything we're doing that we recognise there are issues created over a fairly lengthy and sustained period of the ability of people to maintain standards of living when you compare their wages to inflation. I've not been shy in saying that, but I've also not been shy in saying that we have taken steps to address that. So that kind of sort of straightforward, bland statement, I think, needs to be taken in comparison to how much progress a government has made. And I think we can clearly demonstrate that we have made progress.
Okay. Now, this one goes back onto the subject we discussed earlier, and it crops up every time we do anything of this nature, or any public discussion, any questions we do out of the studio. The same issue comes back again and again and again, and that's public service pensions. And this one now says, it's disappointing budget again. You're moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. That is until someone grasps the nettle, and it's the public sector pension scheme. Come on, guys, it's getting beyond a joke.
Well, the problems, it took government a long time to recognise that this was going to cause an issue. And I agree. I mean, I don't think there's any point in denying it. If say, for example, government had addressed this in 2008, we would be probably halfway through solving the problem. The fact is, it's taken us a long time. It's taken government a long time to both to recognise it, have the negotiations directly with the unions and other interested parties to get some resolution in terms of employee contributions. I think the employees, the staff side, recognise that government's now got to take action to deliver this. From a political perspective, as the Treasury Minister now, I've already said it's incumbent on us, on Treasury and on Tynwald to find the solution, support the right solution, and we will be having that debate before the end of this parliamentary year.
Okay, now next caller on the line is Ken. Good afternoon to you, Ken.
Afternoon, gentlemen. I may not be 100% right about this, but the budget always seems to be a done deal, and it appears to be undemocratic. Because if you don't agree with one thing, you either vote no against it, where you agree with 99%, and I don't know whether you actually do. You go through it clause by clause, and also there's a lot of people, just having listened to most of it, agree with it, and they say but at the end, but they vote for it. And it just seems quite undemocratic how it sort of goes through.
Well,
so I don't know what the process is really.
Thanks, Ken. I mean, I think Roger and I did have a discussion about this before the break at 1 o'clock, but there is extensive consultation with government departments in terms of the budgetary allocation. They come in with their bids. There is a lot of discussion between Treasury and those departments, including the MHKs who are involved in those departments. So in terms of actually reaching where the money needs to be spent and what the allocation is, there is quite a lot of consultation. I think where there's less consultation is around some of the revenue generating items, particularly in taxation. But it's a very difficult area in which to go out and consult on, because everybody has a different view, and I think at some point you have to make the critical decisions as to what's best going to be put in place to serve the island most effectively. So I think there is actually quite a lot of consultation with those departments, and obviously in reaching our decisions as well, we do take into consideration what is being reported to us from various surveys and various other consultations that go on throughout the year with public, such as, for example, there's a big household and income expenditure survey this year. Last year there's been various consultations taking place, including looking at wages and earnings growth. So there is quite a lot of interaction that supports our budgetary decisions.
While you're on, I know we've been on to this before about the government interest rate of 5% that you charge students, which has been 5% since 2009, but there's no action because for various reasons. I just can't see how the government, inflation's rising, so it may be, the wrong time to move, but how can you charge people 5% if they owe government money? I'm thinking about student loans now.
How we can only charge 5%?
Well, the bank and borrowing rate's a lot less than that. I think that's what he's saying, isn't it? It's the base rate's low, and the bank's markup doesn't come to 5% usually, unless it's unsecured loans of a particular type.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the interest rate was set to properly reflect, I think, the cost to government in delivering this as a whole. But with inflation going up now, I mean, we're expecting interest rates to rise.
Well, yes, it's a dead issue now as interest rates rise. But as I say, it was 5% since 2000. I'm surprised that business never complained, because in the UK it went down to about 1.5%.
Right.
For business, but thanks very much for
that. Can I just raise one other point, Roger? I think Ken did raise this issue. I didn't really answer him. He said, "Well, why can't you vote on various elements of the budget?" Yes. I mean, the reason, Ken, I think probably the critical reason is the budget is set as a whole. So if you decide to, let's say, just reject one part of the budget, then you almost you are impacting on the whole distribution of money, and then therefore we're going to have to go back to the table and look at potentially on depending on how much of the budget you've rejected, where that money might be reallocated or where it might be found from. So I think when the government's presenting a budget, it is presenting a whole budget. And I think when you say, well, some people do add a but at the end, they generally do, but I think they're also supporting the direction of travel, even if they don't agree with absolutely everything that's been put in front of them. But trying to get to agreement on absolutely every detail would be incredibly difficult to achieve, and I just can't see putting sort of 30 MHKs in the room to try and thrash it out is going to prove successful.
If you wanted to put something in controversial, it would probably fail. But the other thing is, I'm always worried about with our budget being so early. If the UK for some reason cut VAT from 20 to 15%, your calculations will be out the window anyway.
Yes, but now we've got that's slightly been resolved because the Chancellor of the Exchequer is now delivering his budget in the autumn, which now in fact gives us a few months to...
He does give a pre-statement, yes.
Well, his changed. He's delivering autumn now. So if he did make a radical change like that, that would actually give us a couple of months to decide whether that change was material enough for us to alter our budgetary projections.
Ken,
Thanks very much for your answers.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye. That was Ken. Now, we've got quite a lot of texts and emails here, Alfred. Before the break, I'm just going to see if I can bat quite quickly through some of them so we can maybe get a bit... Let's see now. When are we going to sort out the NI not paid to part-time workers in supermarkets, says Tom.
Well, I'm not... I mean, presumably Tom might be talking about whether part-time workers are falling below the lower earnings limit. We do have a big question around national insurance. I mean, I think Chris Robertshaw raised an issue about national insurance. I think Tim Baker's raised with me questions about the national insurance. We will look at national insurance. We didn't alter rates this year, and we did that specifically because we felt it was the wrong time. The biggest potential cost impact of that would probably come to business. Thought with everything that's going on, Brexit, discussions that we're having with EU code groups about substances, that we continue to be strong and stable and try and ensure that we're continuing to maintain our economic growth. But I did promise all parties that we would look to discuss this and certainly review it in the light of both where we get to later this year with our discussions around substance, and also to ensure that we are properly administering our national insurance to reflect, both the needs of the lower paid, but also making sure that people are contributing properly to particularly state pensions, and that we're not in somehow inhibiting that, whether at the lowest paid society or indeed with the highest paid.
Inflation is not 3%, really. RPI is more like 6%. This budget is about moving money around to create positive spin headlines where no positive headlines actually exist. Well, there is an issue, isn't there, of how you calculate inflation?
Well, we've been through this. We've had these discussions. CPI is the much more accepted rate of government inflation measures, or society's inflation measure. That's a much more, I think, stable basket to look at rather than RPI. And I think government's budgets have always really been based on CPI. So, at the end of the day, I think it's right that we took, the CPI figure. It's most of the figures we can see tend to accurately represent where there's going to be likely cost increases. And yes, in some areas, RPI does creep in, but mostly we think across the board CPI is a much more accurate reflection of the type of inflation that we're seeing. And we are seeing inflationary pressures creeping in. I mentioned that in the budget. I think we've done a pretty reasonable job of incorporating those into our thinking.
Right. Why is mortgage tax relief being abolished?
Well, it's not been abolished. We've maintained our rates of mortgage tax relief. In fact, it's been abolished across most of our competitors, actually, now, as being seen as pretty ineffective support mechanism. We've still got ours on the Isle of Man, and currently have no intention of abolishing it. So we're not abolishing it, although it has been reduced in previous years.
Okay, why won't Mr Cannan make employees paid £41,000 or more pay the same amount of NI as the rest of us?
Yeah, exactly. The same question as I've just answered, really, Roger. We're going to look at our national insurance and ensure that it's properly reflecting the needs of our society. But interestingly enough, I mean, that 41,000 stems back to the days of Margaret Thatcher, actually, where she felt she needed to and wanted to encourage further entrepreneurialism and economic growth, and that's why she capped it at 41,000. Actually, I think it's slightly higher than that, but we do need to take a look at that.
How does the getting an electric bike work for those on part-time employment?
Well, if they're on part-time employment, as far as I understand, they're still eligible for the allowance. And what I would suggest is, if they want some specific clarity on the detail, that they just simply phone the tax office and they'll get the information they receive. But there's no distinguishing, as far as I'm aware, on those on part-time employment as opposed to those in full-time employment.
Could you please say, do you agree with Mr Thomas that the poverty line is 60% and below this equates to £16,500 per annum, which is also the living wage? 14% of the economic active and 70% of pensioners live on income below. Do you say this is fair or a disadvantage to our vulnerable? And what are you going to do to address it?
Well, I think, Roger, I mean, we've been repeating this throughout the programme, that we do recognise there are areas in society that need support. We've done quite a lot, both in this budget and in previous budgets, to try and get to the heart of the issue for the low paid in society, including the additional support that we're giving, for example, with employed persons allowance, the extra additions to their childcare costs. And in terms of pensioners, well, hopefully the majority of pensioners will see some benefit from the personal allowance rise that has come into play this year. And also for those pensioners who are needing income support and other benefits, they will also have seen increases. So, you know, we continue to look and evaluate how government needs to react to these sorts of figures, and we do accept that pushing up towards the living wage and using the living wage as a fair benchmark across society is right. You know, and as this living wage argument progresses, then accordingly we'll be looking at the benefit system and trying to make sure that we're adequately and supporting and targeting our support into those areas that will need it most.
One more before we go to the break, and that is from David. He says, how can the Minister justify the freezing of the Manx pension supplement for at least the third year? This must be close to a 10% reduction. The Minister expresses concerns about squeeze middle. Perhaps there are no pensioners in this group. If this continues for the 20-year phasing out period, it'll be worth very little.
Well, just to be clear, I mean, the Manx pension supplement will be phased out. We'll be starting that phasing out when the new Manx state pension comes in. The new single rate, we think will be set at a fair rate to reflect the needs of our pensioners properly and fairly. In order to simplify the measure, in order to make sure now that people have a much clearer understanding of pension entitlements, we will have this single Manx pension. And so, you know, the necessity for a pension supplement will no longer be there. And let's be clear about the pension supplement. I mean, it was something that was brought in relatively recently. You know, we do, of course, regard it as a necessary supporting measure, a relevant supporting measure to those Manx pensioners now. But it's not always the best addressed mechanism, because it is a universal payment. I think what we need to do as we move forward is ensure, rather than just significant costs applied universally, that we need to make sure that the extra money that we have is directed towards pensioners who actually find themselves in times of need. So that's important that we continue to address that, but it's being phased out primarily because the single state pension will produce, I hope, provide more clarity, and in fact will be a better offering for people.
Okay, time for a break. Welcome back to the last part of today's Mannin Line with Alfred Cannan, who's the Treasury Minister. And Alfred, plenty of texts and emails coming in. In fact, we might have to motor through some of these. We, the public, may not like some of the budget details, says June, but at least Mr. Cannan is explaining the details in plain, easy-to-understand language. Thank you, Mr. Cannan. No big words that we don't understand. There we are.
Thank you very much.
So it's trouble is, of course, in occupations like this, you don't usually get the compliments, you just get the brickbats, don't you? Right. Why have pensioners lost out again, he says. You must acknowledge that the winners and losers in any budget. Do you approve of an All-Ireland senior citizens champion?
Well, I don't think pensioners have lost out in this budget. I was just quickly scribbling down some figures there in the break, Roger. I mean, pensions state pensions going up by 3%, about £190 per annum. If you're a couple as a pensioner, therefore, you're going to be £380 better off with your state pension rises this year. And if you add the personal allowance potential gains from personal allowance increase as well, you could be as much as £680 better off as a pensioner under this budget in a straightforward scenario. Although I do accept, of course, that the personal allowances increases, tend to benefit to different degrees depending on where you are. But if you're even at the lower earnings level, not only is your state pension going to be better off by £190 this next year, if you've got income support or are looking at other benefits from within the benefits system, then they're also going to go up. So I can't accept that pensioners have somehow been ignored underneath with this budget. I think we've done a fair job.
Okay. A rounded budget overall, but you started today by talking about the development fund. 2 years in, we should have invested around about £20 million. Are we on track? Very little has been heard. Does the fund have an on-island presence as promised? That's Simon in Laxey.
Not sure which fund we're talking about there, Roger, I'm afraid. Development fund. Sorry, lost me on that one.
There's quite a few funds, isn't there? So, yeah, there was a... yeah, okay, neither do I, actually, the more I think about it. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
If I could just add some clarity onto which fund we're talking about, I'm not sure which fund
you
that
talked
is.
about being able to get at your patient's records yourself and have a look what's there. Ollie says, I signed up for a patient access nearly 2 years ago and I recently went online to check my test results. I was unable to access that part. The reason being it appears they've opted out for their patients to view their records online. So, in other words, it may be there but not available to everybody, they're saying. Roger, government talks about developing the economy, but I'm beginning increasingly concerned that they aren't recognising the significant change to the world of work that artificial intelligence is going to bring. Would Mr. Cannan commit to initiating a Tynwald debate on technology and the economy? Simon would like to know.
I think that we're always trying to understand what sort of impact changing needs in business will have on our economy. But I think there's no evidence at the moment to suggest that we're going to suffer significant losses in employment at the moment as technology increases. I think perhaps some of the automation will impact on our manufacturing areas, for example. So you look, it's something that we need to keep an eye on, and absolutely, I'm sure that at the relevant point we will have a debate about these kind of matters. But it's not an immediate threat that we are foreseeing in the next sort of 4 or 5 years to the island, and things change every year. I mean, it's very, very fast-paced technology.
The UK Chamber of Commerce has already expressed a concern that if all companies have to adopt the minimum wage, it'll bring effectively a negative result by a lot of those lower-end jobs being automated.
You mean the living wage?
Living wage, you mean, yes, yeah.
Well, I think I think we need to make a decision about this, but I think that encouraging employers to pay the living wage is the right move. What we need to be sure, though, is that we don't over-promote the living wage to such a point where it actually starts to have negative impacts, whereby retail businesses in particular, the costs of delivering that retail business and delivering the product become so so expensive that effectively the business just can't function.
Not
So
competitive.
so I think we support the living wage. We recognise the benefits that it will bring, and we need to keep working towards that, both from government's perspective and as a society.
After taking part in Volunteers' Day yesterday, it was clear that these 26 charities are working very hard as the third arm of government. Without these charities, we'd be in a poor state. I salute everyone who was there. Well, that's a straight comment, but of course the island has always relied on charitable giving, both in labour and money, hasn't it?
Well, and I think it's very important. And again, this was a discussion that I was having the other day. I mean, I think government cannot by itself solve every single problem in society. It's absolutely vital that we recognise the value and the contribution that these charities are bringing to society. And it's fantastic to see how many people actually on the island engage with these charities to try and give something to the communities. And I don't know the actual figures, but I'm pretty sure that the numbers of charities, the amount of giving that goes on this island is equal to or exceeds that takes place in many other areas.
The agreement between Sherman and the unions based on a growth of 6% is a joke. The assumption that we're better off than 2 years ago is ridiculous. Well, are we better off than 2 years ago?
Well,
You said that earlier.
we will soon see, Roger. I mean, the figures, the statistics will soon be out when we start measuring sort of household income, for example. And are we better off 2 years? I would suggest we are. I mean, you can't deny that when you're raising when you've taken the fairly bold steps that we have done with personal allowance, that it will not have made some contribution. And we can also see from the earnings survey that we have, for non-manual roles, managed to see a significant increase generally in people's earnings. So I think we are taking positive steps. I think we've got a long way to go because we've got a big headache to get over after the last 10 years. It's important that we carry on making progress and that we're not complacent about the steps that we are taking to solve and address some of these issues.
Now, we've dealt with most of these. One or two, I've just literally got a few seconds to go and I'm trying to find one we might get off in that period of time. But I'm afraid it doesn't look like that anyway, because most of these things that people would like to talk about are rather long, and just as we're about to finish the programme, 3 more very long ones have come in. So all I have to do really is thank all of you who are listening today for your contribution, and I'm sorry that we've just not got round to the last one. Just very quickly, does Alfred support the new legislation about the credit union?
Yes, absolutely. I'm delighted to see the credit unions come into play, and really pleased that we were able to work together with the relevant interested parties to get that off the ground.
Well, they were, for those of you whose letters and emails we didn't read, including the gentleman who thought that we were using state propaganda, government propaganda by the state radio. There we are. Thank you anyway for all of this. Alfred Cannan, who is the Treasury Minister and the MHK for Air, has been our guest. Catherine Nichol was on the switch. I'm Roger Watterson. Until next week, goodbye.